Fairfax County, Virginia, 2023. In a quiet neighborhood, nothing seemed unusual. Families were living their routines, houses lined the streets, and life appeared calm. But inside one home, a plan was unfolding that would shock the entire community. The man at the center of it was Brendan Banfield. To the outside world, he was just another husband. To his wife, he was supposed to be a partner. But behind the screen of his computer, he was living a double life. He was active on fetish and BDSM websites, carrying on secret relationships, and building a world his family didn't know about. At some point, that secret life crossed a line. According to investigators, Banfield didn't just want freedom from his marriage. He didn't want the cost of divorce, the embarrassment, or the responsibility that came with it. What he wanted was a clean slate, and he was willing to pay for it with his wife's life. Instead of looking for a way out legally, prosecutors say he created a plot for murder. He used the anonymity of online fetish spaces to recruit someone who believed they were joining a role play. In reality, Banfield was setting up a deadly plan. Messages, scenarios, and instructions were passed back and forth, all pointing toward one outcome. His wife would not survive. The more investigators uncovered, the more chilling it became. This wasn't an act of sudden rage. It wasn't random violence. It was a husband designing his wife's death, step by step, using the internet as his cover. And when the case finally reached the public, the details left people stunned. A man who lived under the same roof as his wife, who sat across the table at dinner, who pretended to share an ordinary life, was at the same time orchestrating her murder. This is the story of Brendan Banfield, a husband who, instead of choosing divorce, allegedly turned to deception, betrayal, and ultimately murder. From the outside, Brendan Banfield's life looked predictable. He lived in Fairfax County, Virginia, in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He had a wife, a home, and what seemed to be the foundation of a stable marriage. To neighbors, nothing stood out. They saw a couple who blended into the community, ordinary in every way. Behind that image, though, was a man living in two different worlds. Brendan was not just a husband. Online, he built an entirely separate identity. He spent long hours on fetish and BDSM sites, creating profiles, messaging strangers, and slipping further into fantasies that his wife never knew about. For his wife, life was simple. She valued family, home, and commitment. Friends later described her as caring and grounded, someone who believed in marriage and trusted her partner. To her, Brendan was the man she had chosen to spend her life with. She had no reason to suspect that behind his calm exterior, he was hiding secrets that would eventually destroy everything. Brendan's double life grew more serious over time. What began as secret conversations online developed into ongoing affairs and hidden relationships. He was building connections with people outside of his marriage, exploring a side of himself that he never shared at home. The gap between husband and wife widened. She believed in their future together. He was already imagining a way out. But for Brendan, divorce was never an option. Ending the marriage meant legal battles, financial loss, and social humiliation. To him, the idea of splitting assets and facing the fallout was worse than any consequence. Instead of addressing the problems directly, Brendan fed his escape through the internet. Every message, every conversation online reinforced the distance between his real life and his secret one. In those spaces, he could be anyone. He could reinvent himself. He could erase the part of his life he no longer wanted. That mindset would become the seed of something darker. The man his wife thought she knew was drifting further away, and the double life he created was about to spiral out of control. Brendan Banfield's affairs were more than casual distractions. They were an escape he nurtured carefully. On BDSM websites, he found partners who fed into his fantasies, and those connections gave him the sense of freedom he thought marriage had taken away. But those relationships also created a problem. Brendan wanted a life where he could continue exploring, without the responsibilities that came with his wife and their marriage. Divorce would have solved it in the ordinary way, but Brendan wasn't looking for ordinary. He was looking for absolute freedom, and he was willing to take the most extreme path to get it. Instead of walking away, prosecutors say he began designing a plan to eliminate his wife completely. The internet, which had once been the place where he hid his affairs, became the very tool he used to build a murder plot. He didn't look for a hired killer in the traditional sense. Instead, he manipulated people he met online, presenting scenarios that looked like role play. One of the people drawn into his world was a young au pair. To her, it seemed like she was stepping into a fantasy, part of Brendan's secret lifestyle. What she didn't realize at first was that Brendan was layering real intentions inside the scripts of roleplay. Each instruction, each conversation blurred the line between pretend and reality. This is where the betrayal grew even darker. Brendan wasn't just deceiving his wife. He was deceiving the very people he recruited, convincing them that they were part of harmless games while secretly steering them toward his ultimate goal. According to investigators, he wanted his wife dead, and he was building the steps to make it happen. The more he planned, the colder the details became. Every interaction online was another brick in the structure of a deadly plot. It wasn't messy or impulsive. It was deliberate, designed to mask intent until it was too late. By the time the truth started to surface, the picture was clear. Brendan's affairs weren't just infidelity. They were the doorway to murder. The day of the crime in 2023 began like any other in Fairfax County. Nothing about the morning gave away the fact that a deadly plan was already in motion. Brendan Banfield had carefully built the scenario for weeks, and now it was set to unfold. Inside the Banfield home, the atmosphere carried no warning signs. His wife went about her routine, unaware of the danger that had been circling closer through Brendan's secret communications. What she didn't know was that people Brendan had lured through online conversations believed they were part of a role play, but were in fact following his real instructions. At some point, the fantasy collided with reality. Entry into the home was staged as if it were a burglary. That was the cover story Brendan had envisioned, a way to disguise murder as random violence. The plan was to make it look chaotic, as though intruders had chosen the house at random, leaving investigators chasing the wrong trail. But the crime itself was far from random. His wife was the clear target. She had no chance to prepare or defend herself. The sudden violence ended her life swiftly, and the stage break-in left the scene designed to mislead. To an untrained eye, it could have looked like a robbery gone wrong. To investigators, small details would later reveal the truth. When police arrived, the discovery was shocking. A woman dead in her own home, her life taken without warning. The house bore signs of intrusion, but valuables were still untouched. For detectives, that detail mattered. It raised the first quiet suspicion that this wasn't what it appeared to be. News of the killing spread quickly through the neighborhood. A wife murdered inside her home is terrifying enough, but the fact that the crime seemed senseless made it worse. Friends and neighbors struggled to understand how something so violent could happen in a place so quiet. For Brendan, it may have seemed that his plan was complete. His wife was gone, and the crime scene told a story of burglary and random violence. What he didn't realize was that investigators were already noticing the cracks in that story. The stage break-in would eventually unravel piece by piece, revealing the darker truth underneath. Detectives in Fairfax County began their work the same way they would with any apparent home invasion. The house showed signs of forced entry, and the victim had been killed in what looked like a sudden act of violence. But from the very beginning, there were details that didn't add up. Robbery was the simplest explanation, yet valuables were untouched. Jewelry was left behind, electronics were still in place, and the kind of frantic search typical of a break-in was missing. It looked staged, almost too neat for a real burglary. That small observation planted the first seed of doubt in investigators' minds. They began retracing the victim's final days, talking to neighbors, friends, and family members. Nothing in her life suggested enemies or threats. She wasn't involved in disputes, she didn't owe anyone money, and she wasn't living dangerously. On the surface, she was an ordinary woman in an ordinary home. The question became, who would want her dead? Detectives turned their focus to her husband. In cases like this, the closest person is always a line of inquiry. Brendan Banfield presented himself as the grieving spouse, but investigators noticed things that didn't sit right. His explanations were vague, and his demeanor raised quiet suspicion. Behind the scenes, detectives began looking deeper into Brendan's digital footprint. That was when they uncovered the first real clue. His activity online painted a very different picture of his life. He wasn't just a husband in mourning. He was a man immersed in secret relationships on fetish websites, spending countless hours building connections no one around him knew existed. The deeper they looked, the more troubling it became. Buried in those conversations were hints that went beyond fantasy. Certain messages carried undertones of planning, instructions disguised as role play, and conversations that blurred the line between imagination and reality. Still, the case wasn't solved overnight. For weeks, investigators built their timeline, cross-checking online conversations, mapping Brendan's movements, and interviewing people connected to him. Among them was a young au pair, someone drawn into Brendan's secret world. Her account helped confirm what investigators were starting to see. The supposed burglary wasn't random at all. It was the end result of a plan. At that stage, the picture wasn't complete, but the foundation was set. What had looked like a senseless crime was beginning to reveal itself as something much more calculated. The focus was narrowing on Brendan Banfield, and the mask of a grieving husband was starting to slip. As investigators dug deeper into Brendan Banfield's life, the evidence started to form a disturbing picture. What began as quiet suspicions soon became undeniable proof that this was not a random act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated plan. Digital records told the story. Police traced conversations Brendan had on BDSM and fetish websites. What appeared at first glance to be harmless role-play threads took on a new meaning when placed against the timeline of his wife's death. The language was coded, but investigators recognized instructions buried inside the fantasy. He was writing scenarios that were, in reality, blueprints for murder. The au pair, who had been part of his secret circle, became a critical witness. She explained how Brendan blurred the line between role play and reality, slowly pulling others into his deception. What she thought was a private game revealed itself as something far darker. Her testimony matched the evidence detectives had uncovered in Brendan's online accounts. Prosecutors later revealed one of the most chilling details. Brendan had mapped out the crime so thoroughly that he manipulated an unsuspecting participant into believing they were acting out a fantasy. The truth was that they were carrying out steps Brendan had planned for his wife's death. Financial records added another layer. Brendan was struggling with debt, and divorce would have cost him money and reputation. Eliminating his wife wasn't just about personal freedom. It was also about removing obstacles to the life he wanted to build with the women he met online. To investigators, the motive was as clear as the method. When all the pieces came together, Brendan's double life collapsed. The image of the grieving husband no longer held up against the evidence of secret accounts, coded messages, and manipulated accomplices. Prosecutors now had what they needed, a trail showing not only intent, but deliberate action. The story that emerged was almost unbelievable. A man who could have chosen separation, who could have chosen honesty, instead created a fantasy world that led directly to his wife's murder. He didn't just betray her with infidelity, he betrayed her by turning that betrayal into a death sentence. By the time the case reached court, the mask was gone. Brendan Banfield was no longer just a husband. He was the architect of a murder that stunned Virginia and raised questions about how far someone can go when obsession, secrecy, and desperation collide. By the summer of 2025, the investigation had built into a case strong enough to bring before a grand jury. Brendan Banfield was indicted on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and multiple counts tied to the planning of his wife's death. Prosecutors laid out a narrative that stunned the public. A husband who had used fetish websites not for escapism, but as a platform to recruit and manipulate people into carrying out his crime. The charges highlighted how deliberate the plan had been. This was not spontaneous, not a moment of anger. It was structured, layered, and disguised behind online fantasies. The courtroom filings described messages, bank records, and witness statements that painted Brendan not as a grieving spouse, but as the architect of his wife's murder. When the indictments were announced, the story quickly spread beyond Virginia. National outlets picked it up, framing it as one of the most bizarre and disturbing true crime cases of the year. Headlines focused on the shocking twist: a husband who allegedly asked strangers on BDSM forums to help kill his wife, hiding behind the idea of role play. For the local community, the news hit hard. Neighbors who had once waved to the couple from their driveways now spoke of disbelief and betrayal. They described the wife as quiet, kind, and undeserving of the fate she suffered. They struggled to reconcile the ordinary man they thought they knew with the picture prosecutors presented in court. Family members of the victim faced the hearings with grief and anger. They had waited 2 years for answers, and now the truth confirmed their worst fears. Brendan had not only deceived his wife in life, but had taken her future away in death. In statements to the media, relatives described her as loving and loyal, someone who believed in her marriage even when her husband was living a lie. The case sparked broader conversations online and in the press. Commentators asked how someone could so easily blur fantasy with reality and what responsibility platforms should have when users exploit them for criminal purposes. Others focused on the theme of betrayal, pointing out that the most dangerous threat sometimes comes from the person closest to you. Brendan's indictment marked a turning point. For investigators, it was the culmination of years of work. For the public, it was confirmation of the rumors and suspicions that had swirled since 2023. And for the family, it was the beginning of a long legal process that might bring justice, but could never bring back what was lost. The case of Brendan Banfield forces us to confront a reality that is both chilling and unsettling. A marriage that, from the outside, seemed stable, was hiding cracks deep enough to end in murder. Instead of facing the consequences of divorce or admitting to failure, Brendan chose a path that destroyed not only his wife's life, but also the lives of everyone connected to her. At the center of this story is a woman who trusted her husband. She believed in the vows they had taken, in the home they shared, and in the future they were supposed to build together. That trust was shattered in the cruelest way possible. She didn't lose her marriage in a courtroom. She lost her life in her own home. The case also highlights the disturbing ways technology can be twisted. The anonymity of fetish websites gave Brendan a stage to hide behind, a place where he could mask murder plans as harmless fantasy. What should have been a space for role play became the cover for a deadly conspiracy. It's a reminder of how blurred the line between online and real life can become when deception takes over. For the public, the story became more than just another headline. It was a warning about betrayal, about the hidden lives people can lead, and about the danger of ignoring red flags. It showed how far desperation and secrecy can push someone when they believe they have no way out. For the victim's family, no court verdict will undo the loss. Justice can punish Brendan, but it cannot restore the life that was stolen. The grief will remain, a permanent scar left behind by one man's choices. And for the rest of us, the case raises a haunting question. How well do we ever really know the people closest to us? Behind closed doors, behind screens, what truths remain hidden until it's too late? This was the story of Brendan Banfield, a husband who turned betrayal into murder. What do you think about this case? Do you believe justice will truly be enough in a story like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more true crime stories that reveal the darkest sides of human behavior, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next case.